Hey Sarah, you're still on mute, I think.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Sarah Jamansky. Welcome to this week's Small Ruminant webinar. This meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be posted to YouTube tomorrow. Today, I'd like to welcome my colleagues, Cora Carter and Mary Rodenhuis. Both of them are sheep producers here in the state of Indiana, and they're going to be talking to you about hoof care for sheep and goats today. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Cora and Mary.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Um, I said a little bit earlier I was glad it wasn't raining, and then it started raining on me. So I hope wherever you are, uh, it's not raining. We're pretty over it. And as we'll talk today, rain and moisture is what really can hinder our hoof care and our small ruminants, whether you have sheep or goats. Uh, like Sarah said, I have a small sheep flock. We kind of split our sheep between two areas in central Indiana and southeast Indiana, based on where we've got the most pasture at the current time. Um, and so we have right now, I think about 60 or 70 ewes that we breed every year. We have a wool sheep, Hamps, Dorsets, and Southdowns. We breed for show stock as well as breeding stock, um, and then do a little bit of meat on the side, custom butchering on the side. So if you have any questions throughout this time, please put them in the chat or the Q&A box, and Cora will kind of monitor that while I'm presenting, and then once she takes over, I'll monitor that for her. But ask your questions as we go throughout this program. So one of the things that why hoof care is so important is because it can be so costly. Um, uh, if you have a chronic hoof care issue, you are spending lots of time trying to trim and fix hooves. You're spending potentially a lot of money. And then there's the potential to lose your replacement animals if you can't get control over that chronic foot issue. Um, and so when you look at your flock or your herd, you have to ask yourself, how much, time and money can I invest into chronic feet issues, or do I just need to cull those animals? All right. We're going to talk about some management practices here throughout the presentation, and one of those management practices is culling. All right. If you have a goat or a sheep with really chronic hoof issues you can't get control of, or you get control of, and then the next wet spring or fall it kind of comes back, that's going to be one of our treatment areas. But we can, with good management decisions and practices, we can, kind of get a control over our foot care issues. So when we think about hoof care, we have this nice calendar that you can kind of get yourself on a schedule. The more routine you can put into managing your herd or your flock, the better health your animals are going to be under. And so, like I said, Cole, make that decision kind of later in the year. We'll show the second half of the year here in a second. Quarantine any new animals depending on when you're buying and introducing new animals into your flock. Treat, so at the beginning of the year, if you have some chronic foot issues that have kind of been residing in your flock from a wet fall, go ahead and catch those and then treat those lame ewes. And then again, if you have those repeat offenders, go ahead and mark them so that you can kind of keep an eye on them. Either write them down in your record books, or you can take paint to them so you know to watch out. Those are the ones your eyes are going to go to first out in your pasture and your barns, and you can see, okay, are they improving and getting better, or are they going downhill, or what's happening with those ewes that we treated. In the summertime, we're going to start thinking about foot baths to help lambs and ewes start to control scald if we have any from that wet spring. So it'll start happening end of May, beginning of June. We also want to avoid trying to bring in the bacteria. We're going to talk a lot about what causes foot scald and foot rot and other issues. And so one of those is avoiding bringing that and introducing that bacteria into your environment. And so most of the year we want to try to avoid bringing that in, either if that's on new sheep or goats, or your clothing, your boots, also with your equipment and your barn and how cleanly that is, that'll help avoid transmitting that disease. And a little bit later, we're also going to talk about vaccinating. Vaccinations, real quick, they have a potential to work. If you're having chronic issues, you may want to consult your veterinarian and see if the vaccine is right for your animals. But vaccines can get pretty costly. They have to be repeated very readily. And so, but if you're going to do vaccines, this calendar kind of shows you when to do that. You want to kind of pair it with another management practice. So if you're going to be sorting ewes or goats, to put them into groups for you're waiting to lamb or kid, you can vaccine then, or in the summertime when you're doing like shearing, you can go ahead and administer your vaccine as well too. So wrap it up into another management practice. So the second half of the year, again, you want to cull ewes if they have any misshapen feet. If you have does, are a lot more likely to have a lot of overgrown and misshapen feet. We'll talk about kind of the difference between some of those hooves here in a second. But if you have any that are really bad that you just can't fix, it might be a good idea to cull them. Again, quarantine, we're going to treat, try to avoid, and then vaccinate if that's part of your control strategy. So this is what a healthy hoof should look like. So it's always good reminder to kind of get back to the basics. What do I need to be looking for in healthy hooves so I can compare that to a potentially overgrown or damaged hoof? So our hoof wall is going to be it's going to be a hard hoof wall that's around two toes that have kind of a soft, more sensitive tissue inside of it. And as that hoof grows, it'll grow out, and then that sensitive tissue will also kind of grow and fill in that hoof. So that's really important. If you have an overgrown hoof, you don't want to take off too much of that hoof right away. So that sensitive tissue has a lot of nerves and blood vessels in there. And so it's kind of like if you're trimming your dog's or your cat's toes, you can see that the quick was what they call it, and dogs and cats kind of grows out as that nail gets longer. And if you cut it too short, too fast, you'll get into that quick and make them bleed. Cora is going to talk about why we want to try to avoid bleeding if possible when trimming hooves. But one, it's painful for the animals, and two, can potentially spread disease as well. And now goats will typically have a harder hoof. They are more susceptible to overgrown hooves and then breaking or injury or damage to the hooves, versus our sheep will have a softer hoof, and they're more susceptible to the foot scald and the foot rot issues that we can see. And so it's really important to kind of get to know your animal's hooves. For us on our farm, we have found a difference in breed even with our sheep. Our black face ewes have black hooves, and they seem to be harder, and we have less issues with those black hooves than we do in our Dorsets, or even our speckles that are crosses of those two. They have a white hoof, and it seems to be softer. We don't know, if there's much research behind that or if that's what most people see, but that's what we see. And so we typically have our issues in our Dorsets, our purebred Dorsets that we have. For one reason or another. But it's really important, again, to know your animal's hooves so that you know what's normal, so you can really spot an abnormal hoof pretty quickly. And our healthy animals, they have a dry, pale pink skin and a thin layer of hair in between the toes. And so if it's really wet or gooey in between those toes, or there's no hair there at all, those are indication that there's something hot there, there's potentially an infection, something's not quite right with that hoof. And we think about keeping our hooves healthy, we have to know how to trim our hooves, right? And so the first step into trimming hooves is to gather your equipment. These are the three things that we always have when we go and check hooves, regardless if we have limping or not. We'll routinely check our hooves, especially our rams, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But just making sure that there's nothing too compacted or stuck up in there, or we're not seeing any sort of leading signs of foot scald or foot rot. Sometimes your animals may try to act tougher than they really are, and they don't limp around as much, but they really have an issue going on that you just can't see. Or they go the opposite. They limp around, they act like they're dying, and they don't have that much. They just have a little bit of scald or a little bit of hoof rot going on. And so, again, knowing your animals and knowing kind of what their baseline is really key in keeping our hooves nice and healthy. Um, so in the picture here, we have a set of trimmers. These are a good set. You want to make sure you have a sharp set when you go out there, and so that you can cut through, especially on goat's hooves that are a little bit harder. You want to make sure they're nice and sharp and sturdy. We also have a knife there. That's really key for getting in between those toes where you can't get a good angle in with those hoof trimmers. You have to be careful though, because you can pretty easily take off a good chunk of hoof with the knife. And so if you're going to be using that, practice with it and kind of get used to it, and kind of do some short, shallow cuts at first. You don't want to go too deep too quick. And then it's a product called Hoof and Heal. This is a zinc sulfate product that is really good in drying out the hoof. And so again, Cora's going to talk about hoof rot and hoof scald a little bit later, but one of the important things in trying to manage that and on top of that is getting that hoof dried out. And so this product really helps in doing that. You can get it at most Tractor Supply, Rural King, Premier supply stores, and any kind of zinc sulfate product or copper sulfate product will be good if you can get it diluted into the bottle. That has a tip that's really easy to squeeze onto the hoof whenever you're going to be treating. If you know there's potential for needing an antibiotic to help control, we will take a long-lasting antibiotic out and then syringes as well to administer shots if we need to. But these three things are a key go-to when we're doing our routine checks. Next, we have it's a little bit of a lengthy video, and unfortunately we were trying, a couple of you saw us trying to get the video to work, or to get the audio to work on this video. But this is our some of our ewes. We're going to be kind of showing and getting up and close in there about properly restraining your sheep, as well as the proper trimming hooves. So I'll try to kind of talk through the video. And if you have any questions, please feel free to stop it. We can go back, rewind. But this is kind of a good comprehensive video of how to properly trim a hoof. And so one of the first things, especially with sheep, is going to be to properly restrain them. One thing you can do with sheep that you can't do with goats is you can actually put them on their tailbone. And so here in a couple seconds, you'll see Levi get that ewe and put her on her tailbone. To safely do this, you just push the head away from your body and into their side, and then put a little bit of pressure on their hip pin area, and get them to go down onto their butts. And then you lift their legs, and then you have them kind of in between your legs so they're nice and sturdy. And then the nice thing with the sheep at this point, they can move, they can do small shifts, but they aren't going to be able to jerk and jolt away from you. And so they're fairly immobilized at this juncture. And so it's an easy way if you're by yourself to be able to trim your hooves very easily without assistance. You can also, tie them up. A lot of the times if we're working together, we'll grab one person holds, the other person will lift hooves, and go about it that way as well. And if you're doing goats, that's a good way to do that. So here you can see the hoof. We've got a little bit of extra growth there on the side and on the heel. And so the goal is to get that flat. And so there's a nice flat surface there for that ewe to walk on. And so you'll see here he's going to start clipping away at that extra growth that is present there. You also again want to trim back the toes a little bit. One of the things that will overgrow the most if you have an overgrown hoof is going to be those toes kind of come out. And so clip back those toes to keep them, have a nice steep kind of toe wall there on the front of that toe is going to be essential for a good hoof health. Again, you can see he's just kind of going in there, making small cuts. Again, you don't want to go too deep, too fast, and take away too much and get into that sensitive tissue that could potentially bleed. This ewe wasn't limping. She, pretty good hoof health. We're going to talk about how to score our lameness here in a second. So she wasn't limping around or anything. She wasn't lame, but she needed a little bit of that extra growth kind of cut off so that she had a nice, even walking surface. You can see she doesn't really move around. She's got a little bit of control over her head, so you have to watch, make sure she doesn't bop you or something, but she's not fighting it too much being placed on her butt. This is one of our speckle ewes. If you can see, she's kind of got a marbled hoof. And so again, our sheep, our black face, those black hooves, they're harder. We don't seem to have as many issues. These marbled hooves are a little bit better than our Dorsets, but still, depending on how much white hoof there, they'll be a little bit softer than our black hooves. So there is definitely a difference for us, at least, in our breed character with our hooves. Again, you can see there's a little bit of overgrowth there. The toe is a little bit longer, so we're going to cut that back a little bit and get that, again, a nice level walking surface for the animals to walk on is what you're going after. You also want to make sure you're cleaning out any debris or manure, bedding that's kind of stuck in there, because that can give a nice area for the bacteria to live and thrive and get into that hoof and cause our chronic issues like hoof scald and hoof rot. She had a little bit of an issue. You can't necessarily see it very well in this video, but she had a little bit of hoof scald going on. So we will actually be treating her with a hoof and heel here once we get some of that excess tissue cut away, the excess heel cut away, so we can open that up. One of the goals of hoof trimming is, especially if you're trying to treat hoof scald or hoof rot, is to get oxygen into the affected areas to kill that bacteria. That bacteria is anaerobic, and so it doesn't, once it hits oxygen, it will die. And so this is a hoof and heel product. Again, it's that zinc sulfate product. I do believe it's Dr. Meyer Hoof and Heel. I'm fairly confident that's the brand, but we can. I'll go back to the equipment slide after we're done with the video and double check that. But again, so we dried that out. That helps, get the moisture away, get that hoof dried out, and to speed up the healing of that scald. And again, just trimming off the excess tissue there and make sure that's the toes are up under. They have a nice steep toe, and then the flat hoof surface. This is one of our rams. So this is another way to restrain your sheep or your goats as well. Put them on a stand, get their heads restrained, and then be able to access all 4 feet at that point. And so rams are going to be a little more cantankerous, usually want more body mass. Same with our bucks and our goats. And so they're a lot harder to, put on their butts. And so we choose to either restrain them by holding them, tie their heads up, or put them on a stand. The stand is nice because it gets them up, so you're not having to bend over so much. You can see here, I'm zooming in, the rams had a lot more hoof growth than our ewes did. Our rams are in a much smaller confined area than our ewes are. Our ewes are out on pasture. Their hooves can kind of wear down a lot more nicer and more naturally than our rams do. And so the rams need a lot more care and trimming their hooves more frequently than the ewes do. And so when you're doing this on a stand, it's really important to make sure you have a second person to stand on the opposite side that you're working on, so that in case that animal wants to try to throw itself off, they don't hurt themselves or harm themselves in that process. So having a second person there to kind of help keep them up on the stand is going to be key in keeping them safe and healthy. So we sped this up pretty fast. Again, we're showing just how to trim those hooves and how you kind of pick up both of those hooves based on where you're standing to get full access to them. Luckily, this ram didn't have any hoof rot or hoof scald issues, and so we didn't really need to treat them. So just getting those toes back up under them, getting that steep hoof angle is what we're looking for. And again, you can see how we kind of, as the time goes on, got a little more cantankerous and was not happy being there. Again, the rams or those bucks are going to they're going to have more fight. They're going to have a little more issues with trying to trim hooves. But this is the final product. You saw, before how long those toes were. This got them back up under them, so that he's good to go for another few months. Does anybody have any questions on that video? I know it was kind of a fast way, but it's a good visual to kind of show what you're looking for and kind of what you're going after. Oh. Sorry, Dr. Naylor, I believe is what that hoof product is. Dr. Naylor Hoof and Heel. Again, it's a zinc sulfate product. If you Google like hoof care, things like that, that should come up. It's a pretty common used. Oh, yep, Brenda found the Hoof and Heel. Yep, on Amazon. So it's a pretty accessible product, and it's a good product to help dry that hoof out. Here's a few more pictures. These are of Cora. Cora has a hair sheep in South Central Indiana, and so the equipment, her hoof trimmers are a little bit smaller than hers. Her hooves on her breed of sheep are smaller, so she didn't need as big of a set of clippers. And so again, making sure you buy that proper equipment that's going to be the most efficient on your animals, because I could use that size of the trimmers on my animals, but especially like on our dark hooves, it's going to be really hard to kind of get through. And then, we're making more cuts that way too. So kind of match up your equipment with, the size of animal you're working on. And this, so like she usually halters her sheep and then ties them up, and then that's one way hers can, one person go through and lift up the hooves and treat them. So one thing we really need to get used to doing in our flocks and our herds is lameness scoring. I believe earlier you've talked about body condition scoring and how important it is to make sure we have that proper fat condition on our animals. They're not too skinny, not too fat. So when you're going out and body condition scoring, it's a good time to look at the lameness score or the locomotion score. It's a scale of 0 to 4 depending on how that animal is moving. And so 0 is what we're shooting for. They're normal, they stand, they walk normal, you don't have any short strides. They're not kind of picking up one foot and not putting as much pressure on one foot. That's what we really want. That's, there's no indication. But in 0, we still may need to trim our hooves properly because we have excess growth happening. So just because you have a 0 doesn't mean you don't need to trim hooves or physically check the hooves to making sure there's not a lot of excess growth happening. When we look at our 1, that's going to be a mildly lame animal. Their back is going to be flat when they stand. They've got pressure on other feet, but when they start moving, it starts getting a little tender, and so they're going to arch up and not put as much pressure on one hoof, and so that's what really causes that arching. They're not real comfortable moving around. A 2, they're going to start standing and keeping pressure off of one hoof because it's not comfortable, and so they're going to stand with kind of an arched back. You can tell they're just not, really comfortable standing or a lot of times eating, and so you're going to see some short strides happening in this stage 2 on one or more legs as well. 3, we're getting to the very lame side of things. The one or more limbs is going to be favored, but it's at least going to be partially weight bearing, and so they're going to have that hoof on the ground, especially when they're standing. They may favor it a lot more when they're walking, but this is when we see, okay, we really need to step in and treat these animals. 1 or a 2 is a great way to catch early problems. When we get to a 3, that's a definite. We need to get in and see what's happening to these animals. And then 4 is severely lame. They don't want to at least put weight on one of their hooves. they may have trouble standing, or they just don't want to come and eat because they don't want to put the effort into getting up and walking over to the feeder or the water trough because it hurts so bad. Severely lame is where you're going to have a lot of chronic issues if you let them stay in this 4 position or this 4 score too long. And so if you see that, and it can happen sometimes overnight, they may be fine. They could have an injury. We're talking about some of the causes of lameness here in a second. That happens overnight, and you see they don't want to get up. They don't want to put any weight on that limb. And so don't necessarily think of I'm an abuse in this stage, but if you, especially if you have like a chronic foot rot issue, they can come in and stay in the stage 4 for a pretty long time. So now we have a couple of videos and pictures, and so I want to kind of test what you think, how you think these guys are, or how you would score these animals. It's important to know that this is a objective scoring, and so again, knowing your flock, knowing your herd and your animals is gonna be key in trying to, notice those slight differences, the difference between a 0 and a 1 or a 1 and a 2, because when you've watched and you've visually analyzed your animals multiple times. So what some people may think is a 1, other might think as a 2, and so there's no real wrong answer here. So throw up in the chat box what you think is happening with this guy right here. That's a ram, correct, Cora? This is one of Cora's. Yeah, yep, this is a ram. So you see the short, it's not too long of a clip. Well, let me know, throw up in the chat box what kind of a lameness score or locomotion score do you think this guy is at? Play it again. Anybody have any guesses? And again, there's no wrong guesses here. Yeah, so Brenda said a 2. That's good. I would say he's between a 1 and a 2. So he's kind of he's kind of favoring that one leg right there. Oh, some of the internet's a little slow. So yeah, he's between a 1 and a 2. He's putting weight on all 4 of his hooves, but he's kind of starting to show a little bit of a limp to him. This is a ewe lamb. She didn't cooperate the best, but if you can see that that far front leg there is pretty. She's not wanting to bend it a whole lot and put a lot of pressure onto it as she moves. She really wanted to get back with all of her buddies. I was trying to get a good video of her. I would call her more of a 2, and she kind of goes between a 2 and a 3. She's one of ours that we've been treating and working with for a few weeks now, and depending on this wet weather, it's really been really bad for her hooves. We've been trying to keep her in the barn as much as possible, try to keep those dry so it can dry out and heal. But she kind of goes between that 2 and a 3 depending on the day. This is a picture. If you can tell, here is the toe. And so she's standing on her toe, and at some point she was even on both of her back legs standing on the front of that cannon bone there. So throw up in the chat box what you think we would score her at. And this is just a picture, so she's not going to be walking around and moving much. So. We got some 4. So she is weight bearing on both of those back hooves. We called her a 3. And actually after we got in there, trimmed, put some hoof and heel in there, and then treated with a long-acting antibiotic because she was showing the pretty good start to hoof rot. She started walking a lot more normal. So The reason she's up on those toes is because the hoof is really sore. It's really soft, it's sore, and so she didn't want to put weight on those. After we got it kind of cut back a little bit, it was still sore. You could still see her taking really short strides, but she started coming back and relaxing onto that hoof. And so we called her a 3 because we had just noticed her doing that in the past week or so, actually. And so we're going to go check her again. That's the unfortunate part of having 2 farms. We don't always get back every single day. And so we'll check her again this weekend while we're up there and seeing what progress we have. But we do have her being monitored. If there was a severe issue, she wasn't getting up, things like that, we would have gone up there and treated her. Ooh. And one more. Look at this black sheep right there. So again, it's a pretty short video. This one is different because it's actually getting up and moving, but it's not wanting to put any weight on that one of that front hooves there. And so I called this one a 4 just because there is one limb that she doesn't want to put any weight on at all. Now, if we get in there and trim it, she starts getting some weight back on there, she'll come back down. Thankfully, it's not a severe 4, but I would still call her a 4 just because she's not wanting to put any weight on that. Typically, if you've got an animal in that 3 range, they'll still put some pressure on all 4 limbs. And that 4 is when we start seeing no pressure. So again, it's a very objective scale. And you can hear me saying, it's a slight 4 or a hard 4. And so that's what getting to know your animals is going to be key to helping use that lameness scoring to evaluate the hoof health of your flock. That was a lot of H's. So now we're going to get into the causes of lameness. And one thing we didn't really touch on in this presentation is going to be disease. So there's a handful of diseases, although more rare, that can cause lameness. They can. And so if you're seeing kind of lesions on that hoof or like a weird red mark around where that hoof connects to the bottom of the foot there, that may be due to a disease and not necessarily hoof rot or hoof scald. So like blue tongue can cause that's pretty rare disease, but it can cause lesions on the hoof. Foot and mouth. Shelly hoof is a disease that they don't really know what it comes from, but it's basically that the hoof makes an opening, kind of starts coming apart off of that sensitive tissue, and so stuff can get in there and get infections. And so there's a handful of diseases that they're not as common. So if you're having issues, or if you have any pictures, you're like, I'm just not sure. I don't think this is hoof rot. I don't know what's happening. Feel free to send them to us, and we can try to help diagnose what's going on through that picture. But one of the causes of lameness is going to be injury. If you have a pasture that you have some metal in, or you have a neighbor that likes to dump stuff in your pasture. I have heard that before. They can step on a piece of wire, a piece of metal, and cut their hoof and create a lesion in there. They can step in a hole and sprain their hoof anywhere up and down that hoof or that leg. They can kind of sprain and tweak, and then they'll start favoring that leg a little bit. Or even different plants that you have in your pasture. We have one pasture that we call Thorn Valley, that there's thorny trees out there. Unfortunately, they're very old trees that they're not going to go anywhere, and they're the only shade trees. But we know to continually check hooves for the issues of thorns in case they get up in between that hoof. And so what you want to do is making sure that if you've got an animal that's you start seeing favoring a leg or limping, check to make sure there's no foreign material up in there. Like I said, like a thorn get up in there, create an abscess. If you see that pus kind of start coming out like an abscess, and it takes a little bit to know the difference between the pus from foot rot and the pus from an abscess, but once you kind of look and see the color and where that is necessarily coming from, you might have an abscess up underneath that foot. And so treating that with an antibiotic is going to be key in helping reduce that. Try to get as much as that out of that abscess as possible, and then remove any of that foreign material that may be there. Again, if you have any swelling happening to your joints, kind of palpate or feel up that leg to see where that swelling has occurred. Typically, your animal is going to kind of wince and try to pull back their leg once you hit exactly where that pain is coming from. And then and typically it'll be kind of hot. It'll be inflamed and hot. And so that's a good indication that you've sprained or potentially even broken something in that leg. Broken limbs will just kind of hang there. And they're not going to put, they may try to put weight on there, but they can't put weight on that leg. And so that's going to be a very severe issue depending on where that break is. It's going to be how easy that is to heal. And so that might be something where for the quality of care of that animal, that may need to be put down. Or if you can get them into maybe a processor, I know that's really hard right now, but get them into a processor that would accept that, and then you can get some meat out of them. But depending on where that break is, it can be pretty severe. Usually a sprain, put them up into a pen in the barn so they don't have to move around, and use that limb a whole lot will help start treating that, and then contact your veterinarian to see exactly what they would suggest in terms of antibiotics or medication to give those animals. Another thing that can cause lameness is acidosis or founder. If you have any horses, I'm sure you've heard of founder laminitis. That can be caused by an acidotic, either acute or chronic. And so what acidosis is going to be a shift in the pH of your animal's rumen. And this occurs if an animal gets their feed changes too rapidly, and so you're starting to bump up their grain intake, especially like on lambs or kids, and you're trying to get some weight on them and get them used to the grain. If they get too much of that feed or you switch that over too fast, that can cause acidosis. Or if the animals get into a whole bunch of feed that they weren't supposed to, that would be a acute acidotic response. And basically what that does is it causes that gut to basically break down, and then it gets the inflammation into the hooves, which causes that founder to happen. And so we actually had this happen to us, I think about 2.5 years, 3 Christmases ago. We were up visiting family. We got home, went out to the barn to feed, and noticed our ewes had become Houdinis and got the chain off of the gate, opened the gate, and helped themselves into our feed room. We don't really know exactly all they ate. There was a bunch of grain that got into, dog food, cat food. There's a whole bunch of stuff. Our saving grace was that at that point we had hay stored there, thankfully, and so they also had some hay to munch on that helped, so that the acidotic event wasn't as severe. And thankfully, so we noticed that the next day we called our vet. She prescribed us Banamine. And so we went up and got the Banamine. What the Banamine does is helps with the inflammation from that acidosis event. And so again, that's what's going to cause the hoofs basically they can kind of slough off, and so from that inflammation. And so we dosed everything with Banamine the next day. That night we shoved as much baking soda as we could find, tried to get that down in them, and left that a bunch around in the pen, and so they can get the baking soda, helps kind of coat their gut. And then we threw a bunch of straw down for them to munch on that really fibrous straw to help kind of keep their guts healthy. And so those are things to kind of do in the short term. And then, like I said, we got the Banamine the next day and dosed everybody with Banamine. And then our vet also recommended sulfa boluses, which basically kills the gut kills the rumen. And then you introduce probiotics into their diet to try to restart the good bacteria to make that animal healthy again. Thankfully, there was about 40 that got out that day. We only had one that was severe enough that wouldn't get up. She has since spent some time 3 days on the ground because of her feet hurt so bad from that inflammation. And so, but we did eventually turn her around, and she's still in the flock today. But it does take constant. We were out there every hour checking on her, getting her water, trying to get her to eat some really straw and grassy hay to get that the long fibers in there to try to help kind of restart that rumen. One thing you can do, depending on your comfortability or your accessibility to it, is get rumen content from a donor animal. So you want to try to stay in your species. If you've got goats, you can get a donor ewe to provide some rumen fluid. Worst case scenario, you can get from a cow. It's easiest to get kind of that donor rumen fluid from a cow because most universities have cannulated, or most universities have cannulated cows that they do research on. So if you're in a close proximity to a university, that's an option there. But you can get rumen fluid using a tube and a syringe. You put the tube down in the esophagus of your healthy ewe, use a syringe to pull out rumen fluid, and then put it right into the ewe or the doe that is experiencing that acidotic event. And that helps kickstart that good bacteria to take over and get that rumen healthy again. But it is a lot of work. You can also use activated charcoal if you have it on hand. That will help absorb some of those particles and kind of help neutralize that rumen as well. And then mineral oil too will help kind of coat and neutralize that rumen as well. And so those are hopefully not as common as the issues as some of our hoof rot and our hoof scald, but can be very detrimental to your flock and your animals if they occur. So now Cora is going to take over and talk about the other causes of lameness.
All right, so something that's really common to a lot of our sheep and goat farms is something called hoof scald. It comes from the bacterium Diclobacter nodosus. And signs include some inflammation in between the toes, like Mary was talking about. It can come with a little bit of a white layer in there as well, and it has this really strong smell, and that's how you can really tell that it is the certain type of bacteria. Once that you have experienced the smell of hoof scald or foot rot, you will be able to tell which sheep has foot rot as soon as you pick up the foot. It is significantly different from a kind of a pus smell, like from the abscess. That's not the same smell as the foot rot smell. So once you've experienced both, you'll be able to kind of feel like you're an expert, because you'll be able to say this sheep or goat definitely has foot rot or hoof scald. And foot rot and hoof scald are actually come from the same bacteria, and hoof scald is early foot rot. So it's when the bacteria are living up in between the cloves of the hoof, and it is not as easy to see from the outside, but you'll be able to tell once you are lameness scoring your animals, which animals are favoring hooves, and you'll be able to kind of separate those animals out and examine what's going on in there. Hoof scald can be caused by abrasion from harsh or rough surfaces. So as Mary was talking about before, if there's thorns or rough concrete or a metal piece out in your barn lot because your neighbor threw it there and your animal has walked across it, that abrasion can allow the bacteria to enter the foot. And also poor trimming practices can cause the spread of the bacteria as well, because if you have some animals that have the bacteria and some that don't, and you trim all the animals on the same day without sanitizing any of your equipment, you're just spreading that bacteria to every single animal that you just trimmed. So it's really important to make sure you clean your materials in between every animal, and that can make sure that you don't spread the bacteria from one animal to another. Another cause of hoof scald is prolonged exposure to moisture. So that causes the skin to soften up and really allows the bacteria an entryway into the hoof as well. The bacteria are living out in the barn lots, the pastures, your barns, and that's where those little bacteria are able to get in, especially in those moist areas. They really love moisture. So this is a photo of kind of a severe form of hoof scald. So this is almost into foot rot territory, but it does have that white scum layer you can see on it. Treatment of hoof scald is by antibiotic injection or antibiotic spray, as Mary was saying, with very minor cases, and with more extreme cases, you want to treat with some zinc sulfate or some copper sulfate, and we'll get into that when we get into the foot rot section. But hoof scald can be treated pretty easily with a foot bath, and that foot bath would have the zinc sulfate or copper sulfate in it. And you'll want to try and separate the infected individuals into a group that is all infected, so that you're keeping them separated from the clean animals. Just as you want to make sure your tools are clean every time you use them, you want to make sure that the animals that are clean are separated physically from the animals that are not. Regular foot bathing, and especially in the spring when it's really wet, is a good idea. That helps make sure that the animals are prepared, and it helps dry out those hooves when it's nice and wet outside. And you want to remove abrasive surfaces in your facilities and clean up around your farm, as well as applying lime or some sort of heavy use pad in heavily trafficked areas. So around your waterers, around your food pans, or in gateways or places where animals are traveling through a lot. You want to make sure that those areas are not places that are packed with mud. Okay. And we have this hoof care calendar again that Mary was talking about before, and right now we're in this, we're talking about the treating section as well as the avoiding section. So foot bathing is a really easy way. Well, I wouldn't say easy so much, depending on how many animals you have, and they certainly get used to it eventually, and they'll act a little bit better the longer you're working with them. But sometimes foot bathing can be a very stressful experience for the people that are helping to send the animals through the foot bath. But foot bathing is a way to make sure that you're controlling that scald and preventing it from turning into foot rot. And we want to talk a little bit about how you want to avoid the incidence of bacteria being able to get into your animals in the first place. So making sure that your handling systems, including your foot baths or any surfaces that animals walk across, are as clean as possible by using lime or gravel or wood chipping to make sure that you don't have the high traffic areas sitting there with wet and muddy conditions. You want to move things that you can move easily. So if you have food pans, you want to make sure you move those around, and maybe move your waterers if that's possible, so that the same area is not getting high traffic every day. Foot rot is something that comes from the same bacterium, and the signs include a kind of a gray pus that that distinctive foul smell. It's the same smell between foot rot and hoof scald. And it really, foot rot is when you get into the separation of the hoof wall and the sole. So the outside of the foot is actually falling apart. It's due to the warm, moist conditions. It's really bad in the spring and fall, but wet summers and mild winters like we've been having lately as well have really created a year-round problem for hoof rot or foot rot. So it's really hard to control, and we're going to talk a little bit about some management strategies here in a little bit. Treatment for foot rot is some long-acting antibiotic injections and antibiotic sprays. You want to trim to make sure that you're exposing those bacteria to oxygen, and don't use animals with chronic or severe foot rot as replacement stock. It does have some genetic component, and so just like Mary was talking about, some of her sheep are less susceptible, and those are the ones you really want to choose. You want to choose animals to restock, especially rams that don't have foot rot issues. Cull animals that have foot rot more than twice in the same season. If you get them over the foot rot and they have it again, you can give them kind of a 3 strikes you're out ultimatum and get them out of there, because those animals are going to have misshapen hooves, and that's going to just make more places for the bacteria to live. Really try and make sure that your lameness scoring and trying to see which ones are mildly lame before it gets worse. Quarantine your incoming animals, because you don't know if the farm that you're getting your new animals from is clean. And there is a potential for a vaccine, like Mary said, but it is very costly. And if you have a lot of animals, it's probably not cost effective to try to vaccinate your animals. The prevention is really the best route to go. With the combination of foot baths and quarantine, you might be able to prevent foot rot from ever coming onto your farm. So that's really the best way to go, in our opinion. Cull chronic animals. Keep only the animals that make your flock better. Be tough. I know it's hard, especially when you don't have a lot of animals or you get attached to them. But culling hard the first year you have foot rot around will really boost your resilience. It'll make sure you keep animals that are more resistant to the foot rot in the first place, and you won't have as many problems in the future. If you keep animals that have had severe foot rot and have misshapen hooves, then you're just going to prolong that issue. It's very hard to get rid of foot rot completely if you've got animals around that are harboring it. Quarantine. So keep your farm clean. Any animal that's been off farm, even animals that you own that are going to a show or an exhibition or something, even those animals, when they return to the farm, should at least be foot bathed before they re-enter with other animals, and ideally should be quarantined in a clean lot that's separate from the other animals for up to 2 weeks. Know the origin of your animals. Make sure you check hooves before you buy animals so that you know that those animals don't have the misshapen feet and aren't somebody else's culls. Be responsible when you're using antibiotics. Antibiotics are a great way to treat hoof scald and foot rot, but use them where they're needed, when they're needed, and at the dosage you need to use them at. Never underdose, because if you're underdosing, you're just increasing antibiotic resistance in our bacteria, and it makes it harder to use antibiotics in the future. Always discuss dosage rates with your veterinarian, especially if because there's not a lot of antibiotics that are labeled specifically for sheep and goats. You want to make sure that if you want to use something that's not labeled for sheep and goats, you must talk to your veterinarian, because that's called extra label use, and it is illegal if you do not have a veterinarian prescribe it to you. Always read and follow your label instructions for your withdrawal times. Withdrawal times are so that you protect our food and food supply. That includes meat and milk. So there should be withdrawal times for both meat and milk, and you cannot use that animal for meat or milk if you haven't completed the withdrawal time. That means you really should not ever allow an animal to leave the premises without completing the withdrawal time. It's up to you to make sure you've completed the withdrawal time. It's not up to the next person you sell it to make sure that they don't harvest it before the withdrawal time is completed. Footbathing is a good part of a small ruminant management plan, so you should always make sure you have clean and safe equipment. The animal's feet should be clean before it goes in there. I know that can be really hard at times, but the cleaner the foot bath is, the more effective it can be. Make sure you use solutions at recommended concentrations. So copper sulfate and zinc sulfate are 2 main options for a foot bath active ingredients. And copper sulfate is quicker acting, but if you're going to leave it in there with the sheep, or if you're going to leave the animals in the foot bath for a certain amount of time, then you want to beware, because sheep have a sensitivity to copper toxicity. And so zinc sulfate is really the safer alternative for sheep specifically. Goats don't have as much of an issue with copper toxicity, but if you're going to give them copper boluses or supplement copper in your goat's diet in other ways, you might want to be concerned a little bit about copper toxicity as well, and use the zinc sulfate as a good alternative. Want to properly disinfect your system after every use, and make sure the animals are standing on a clean, dry, hard area for up to 30 minutes after foot bathing. 30 minutes is really when their feet get nice and dry and they can go back out on the pasture. Here's an example of a foot bath setup. So the slanted sides make sure that the sheep or the goats have their feet down in those troughs. And the troughs is where you're going to put the foot bath material. The long 2-foot baths next to each other, make sure that they can't jump over the whole thing. So you can put this in a doorway so that they have to come and go through it all the time, but that's going to make sure that it's nice and dirty in there. So you might want to make sure that you use this once per week and you drive them through it, and then that's what you do, and then you clean it out and you sanitize it for the next time. That's really probably the best bet. Make sure you avoid problems in your facility by proper cleaning. Improve your underfoot conditions. Don't allow the animals to stand in mud or water. Regularly clean out your barns, aisles, holding areas. That packed bedding can just really create heat because it starts to compost on the bottom when it gets to be nice and thick, and it traps moisture, and that's a great place for bacteria to live. Leaking waters are also a wet area that animals have to go to get a drink. So if you are having automatic waterers, or if you have a watering tub that isn't sound, you will need to replace that right away, because that can cause a moisture area that the animals have to come to. This is a picture of actually my parents' barn, and it hasn't been cleaned out recently because it's been winter time, but you can see that bedding is really packed down in there, and we need to get in our skid steer and scoop it all out and clean it out really nice, because that's just creating a nice environment for the bacteria to breed in. Grazing management is another way to manage foot issues. Foot rot bacteria can live on a pasture for 14 days. So make sure that you're not rotating your pastures quicker than 14 days. If you can make sure that you don't go back to that same pasture except for every 14 days, then you're able to kill the foot rot bacteria in that particular area. Try to move animals after foot bathing to an animal-free lot that's been animal-free for 2 weeks. And if it's possible, you can keep a spare field for treating your diseased animals or for quarantining your animals once they come back from another facility. Oops, I'm sorry. And then use that heavy use pads in highly trafficked areas so that you can't move, like a gateway or something like that. And there are some equip funds from your NRCS office that could possibly be used to create these heavy use pads, like a concrete pad or kind of a lime pad. So contact your local NRCS office, and they can help you out with some equip funding, like a grant that would help you pay for that. Biosecurity is important. You want to avoid bringing bacteria from other farms. So if you or someone who's visiting your farm has recently been off farm, especially if it's someplace where they also have sheep or goats or cattle, then you want to make sure that you walk through a simple foot bath before you visit your facility, and that can really clean off the bacteria from your shoes. And also, if you have animals at multiple locations and you don't usually switch those animals between locations, then you want to definitely make sure that one location doesn't get the bacteria from another. So you'll want to switch shoes and potentially your clothing between those locations as well. It's the same when you're moving sheep or goats from one farm to another. You want to foot bath them before you take them, as you're taking them to the other farm, so that they're clean when they arrive. Here are some resources that we used. The Purdue Extension publication referenced here is actually in our Google Drive box, so you'll be able to have access to that publication as well. And then a copy of this presentation in PowerPoint form and in PDF form will be available in the Google Drive box as well if you'd like to have access to these other resources we used. Please type your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and make sure and take time to fill out the survey. I think they'll put the survey link again in the chat box because that's really important for us to find out how useful this information was. So tune in next week for safe transportation best handling practices.
Yeah, so Cora, we had a couple questions come through. The first one, get back to it. On the back side of the leg, above the hoof, is some kind of pad, just like dogs have. What is it called, and do you trim it? I'm pretty sure you're referring to the dew claw. So you have the cannon bone, and then right above that is like usually like two little knots. The dew claw usually doesn't need to be trimmed. It doesn't grow like hooves do, but some animals they grow a lot more, so you can get in there and trim that back. Again, you want to be sure you're not trimming too much of that off because it is a sensitive tissue. But typically it doesn't need to be have too much attention. I'm not sure what the purpose of a dew claw is. Cora, do you know what I'm sure it had an evolutionary purpose at one point. But I'm not too sure what that is right now. But yeah, typically it doesn't cause much problems. But if you do have one that's kind of getting wonky, or like in our dogs, sometimes it'll kind of grow into their skin again. You can trim that back little by little and clean that up a little bit.
Yeah, but I've never seen dew claws in a sheep or a goat growing back into their flesh. I have seen some pretty crazy looking ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can trim them, but they're often very dry and hard to trim, and they don't have like a basic structure that's similar to the hoof, so it's hard to get onto the edge of it and make sure you're not taking off too much when you are cutting them. So unless it's really causing a problem, I would leave it.
Yep. Someone else asked, and I answered this in the chat, but I also wanted to readdress it again. How do you administer the charcoal? So with charcoal and like baking soda, one of the keys is getting it in their rumens as fast as possible. So mix it with a little bit of water, and then drench it into them, and so they don't have that option to eat it or not. And so especially if you have somebody that's pretty severe and you want to get that in as fast as possible, go ahead and drench it. And then like I said, we left extra baking soda out in lots of feeders so that they can go nibble on that through the night when we weren't able to sit there and drench them. But we drenched them first and then left extra out for them to kind of nibble on. And that's kind of a good indicator if to kind of see if they've started eating again. So typically our animals they're acidotic, they don't feel like eating, and so it's hard to get them to go. So if you see certain nibble bites through that baking soda or charcoal, okay, we're heading in the right direction because they're nibbling on this. And then the last question I believe I have is, with foundered hooves, is there a proper way to trim their hooves? One of the things to do is to treat the cause of the foundering first. You want to get that acidotic, the acidosis, reversed and get them healthy again. You don't want to trim too much of the hoof away, so you can do a little bit of the toe and kind of get that hoof back flat again. But the biggest thing with the foundering, if you had somebody that foundered, is kind of multiple trimming, kind of consistent small trimmings. That kind of helps the blood flow come back to the hoof and starts making that hoof healthy again instead of sloughing off. When it sloughs off, it's because there's no blood flow getting into that hoof. And so consistent small trims daily or every other day will help get the blood flowing back into that hoof and save that hoof. So very good question. Oh, there's another one in the Q&A. I have seen European studies that use Zactran that has to treat the entire herd and eliminate hoof infections. Hasn't been tried in the U.S. So Zactran is oh, I just blanked. It's a really good antibiotic. I'm trying to think of the class it was in, but Zactran and Draxxin are in the same antibiotic class. We've used Zactran before. We worked with our vet and got it prescribed, and so you would have to. It's something that has to come from your veterinarian. It's not like an LA200 or a penicillin you can just pick up, but it is very effective if you can find it. It is a little pricey, but it does work really, really well in controlling hoof rot issues and getting rid of that hoof rot issue. So yes, a Zactran does work very well. But again, you need to work with your vet in order to source that.
There's another question in the Q&A. Would you recommend a Hoof Boss tool or just trimmers?
So we've always just used trimmers and then have success. It really depends on what you're comfortable using and what works on in your flock. Like trimmers work for us, and so we really haven't needed to experiment with other things. Cora, do you have any input?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what a Hoof Boss tool is, but those green hoof trimmers have been the thing that we have used for many years, and we just continually buy more and more of the same exact ones because they work perfectly for us. So um, I don't know. If there's a tool that claims to be the end all be all most perfect oh, it's a grinder.
It's a grinder. So um, the biggest thing with the grinders is you can go way too far with it really easily. It can take off way too much of that hoof. So unless you're comfortable using it, like I said, the trimmers have always worked well for us, and we haven't necessarily needed. But on goats' hooves, they are harder, so there may be more of a need for a grinder or things like that. But again, you really need to be comfortable. Go slow with it, especially if you're new to using it. And go really nice and slow with it so you don't take off too much of that hoof.
Sarah, do you have any experience with the Hoof Boss or a grinder to trim goats' hooves?
I know a lot of people like them. You have to be really careful with them because they will produce a lot of heat and they can damage the tissue of the hooves. And so a lot of people like the Dremel type tools for hooves as well. But again, you have to be really careful with any grinder type tool.
And Jeff added they used Zactran about a year ago and haven't had a limper since. So yeah, Zactran is very effective as long as you're not reintroducing that bacteria into the environment. And so if you can, eliminate that bacteria by, really treating your animals, getting them on a dry lot, and then not introducing them back to the same area for 2 weeks, that will definitely help in cleaning your environment. But yeah, Zactran it's pretty efficient. But again, work with your veterinarian because they will have to prescribe it to you. So, all right. Anything I missed?
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining today. Make sure that you follow the links that I posted with the survey, the evaluation for today's program. We'd appreciate it if you'd fill that out. And also, a copy of today's presentation is available at the link to the Google Drive. Next week is going to be our final presentation of the spring series. Once we get into June, we're going to start with monthly presentations. And so if you have topics you would like us to cover in the summer monthly presentations, we would appreciate you putting those in the evaluation. So once again, thank you for attending, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, everyone.